Well, good morning, guests, friends, and family. For the next 45 minutes, I think we have a really important opportunity to speak with two distinguished public servants, Tom Kean and Lee Hamilton, about their role in leading the 9/11 Commission, which I think, as everyone knows, is probably the most impactful commission that has ever occurred and may ever occur. The conversation today is obviously very much focused on the response to the January 6th insurrection. Following their leadership of the 9/11 Commission, Tom and Lee are not people to rest on their laurels. They joined the Bipartisan Policy Center and for over a decade continued to lead task forces and reports and interact with members of Congress and the administration to both assess progress in achieving the goals of the recommendations and also elaborating on some of the key questions that have been left unanswered, particularly with a focus on the threats of domestic radicalization. Shortly after February 12th, the members sent a note to the leaders of Congress, President and Vice President, offering some basic suggestions on how they thought a commission, if one were put together, could function most effectively. And since that time, we have been receiving literally dozens of requests from people wanting to know what Tom and Lee think. It is a burden to be iconic, but also a power. And we are here today to really just think a little bit more directly about some of those key design questions that we think will affect both the capacity to pass legislation creating a commission, but also the capacity of a commission to succeed. So just to set the table for one more moment, there's a lot of expectation on Capitol Hill that there will in fact be a 9/11 type commission. All four leaders of Congress have endorsed the idea. Bipartisan legislation has been introduced in the House. Groups in the Senate, including Senators Blumenthal, Coons, Graham, and Cassidy, have called for a commission. And the Speaker put together a rough outline of some of the big provisions that would guide the establishment of a new effort. That outline was not completely embraced by Republicans. And so I think part of what we're going to try to discuss today is what would be the elements, the design elements that would make a commission truly successful. And so with that, gentlemen, it's really great to see you. And I think what I want to do is just a couple of big picture questions and then really kind of dig into these issues and controversy. But just as an entry point, maybe let me start with you, Tom. What would be the value of a effectively functioning commission to explore what happened around January 6th?
Well, there are big unanswered questions, and will continue to be big unanswered questions unless there is an in-depth investigation. We need to know how the Capitol was breached. It was such a shock, not only to Congress, but to the American people. How did it happen? Why did it happen? What's the background? Why wasn't the Capitol defended properly? Who were these groups? Did they originally intend violence, or was a lot of it instigated on the spot? Are there groups who plotted as much as 3 weeks in advance, as some people have suggested? We don't know the answers to those questions. So it seems to me the logical thing to do would be to form a group that can really get to the bottom of why it happened, how it happened. And again, like the 9/11 report, use that report to make recommendations to make sure it never, ever happens again.
So, Lee, one of the basic questions is it necessary to have a third party group, as opposed to having Congress or the executive branch itself try to, render thoughts on what Tom was suggesting? How do you think about the capacity of Congress to do this and the need for some kind of external commission?
You want a commission of investigators who can focus on the questions that Tom was talking about a moment ago exclusively, and to focus with all the resources available to them on those questions. The problem with Congress is they can't do that. They just have too many things on their plate. They keep getting more on the agenda almost every day or week, and they cannot give the focus on this investigation that is necessary. It's inherent limitations in the investigatory policy, capacity of the Congress. what impresses you when you sit in the Congress is the problem just keep rolling in day after day, new problems, and you cannot deal with time. And that's what you need here to get the answers, the very difficult answers to the questions Tom raised.
Thank you, Lee. And Lee, I think your sound is still coming in a little choppy, so I may be leaning on the governor here for some of the longer answers. Hopefully the gerbils spinning your Verizon account will get busy. I want to ask you both about just the basic political setting, right? There's this sense that, back in 2000, everybody liked each other on the Hill and there was collaboration, but now, it's just not possible to imagine a successful exercise that requires bipartisan support. And while I don't want to reflect too much in terms of the past as opposed to focusing on what's before us, remember a little bit about the dynamics in 2001. Things were pretty tough back then, as I remember politically. And if you could just remind us all of some of the dynamics that were at play when Congress, in fact, successfully created the 9/11 Commission.
Yeah, if you want me to take start of that one, people look at the past with rose-colored glasses. And that's probably a good thing. We should forget some of the bad stuff. But look, that was also a rough time. President Bush was running for re-election. The time he had run before was Bush versus Gore, a Supreme Court decision. We forget there were Democrats who continued to question the legitimacy of the Bush presidency. He was running for re-election. The Congress was a very partisan Congress, particularly the House in that time. And so it was difficult. It was a difficult partisan time, perhaps not quite as bad as this one. This is maybe the worst I've ever seen in some ways, but that was bad too. And so we had to overcome a lot of partisanship, a lot of rough times, and we were able to do it. But that was also a rough time.
So I want to turn, Lee, to starting to discuss what's in front of us. There are a few just very critical design questions. The question around membership, how the chairs function, the scope of the investigation, the powers, the timing, the funding. I think this is where we really want to now bear down a little bit. And while it was partisan, the legislation that created the 9/11 Commission, in fact, passed by a voice vote in the House and with unanimous consent in the Senate. How important was that initial bipartisan foundation, Lee, for the work you were able to do?
I think bipartisanship is absolutely essential. If you cannot get bipartisanship and a bipartisan recommendations, the chances of implementation are slim to none. Everything depends on the quality of the people that you select. Tom and I spent more time going over lists of names of people to fill various slots, not just on the itself, but on the staff and even that the staff called upon. So you have to get the right people. Now, what do I mean by that? I certainly mean bipartisanship. They have to be able to see things as they are and not as their partisan instincts would lead them to believe. They have to be willing to go to the facts. Tom and I used to turn to the staff every day and say, what are the facts? You cannot get consensus on a solution unless you begin getting a consensus on the facts. And that's what we put very great emphasis. Now, a lot of other things have to happen. You mentioned them. They've got to have adequate resources, obviously. They've got to have a mandate that is clear, specific, and you keeps them on target. And they have to refer constantly to that mandate. They have to be given adequate time. They cannot be forced to make a conclusion within a matter of days or weeks. You cannot put them up against a timeline. You've got to give them time to operate. So there are a lot of things that come into making a sound commission. I think we hit the target in time, not always the first try, but we did it over time. It can be done, but the quality of the people is the key.
So Lee, you've given us now the table of contents for a bunch of follow-up questions. The flashpoint, and I'm going to put this to you, Tom, right now, about whether we move forward or not, is whether the commission has an equal balance of members from a partisan standpoint. I think the speaker's proposal was 7 Democrats and 4 Republicans, and that was immediately dismissed by the Republican caucus. The 9/11 Commission was equally balanced, I believe 5 and 5, Democrat and Republican. So Tom, you and Lee indicated obviously of enthusiasm for bipartisanship. Do you think it's essential to success that there is an equal number of Democrats and Republicans on any commission?
I think it's essential because otherwise, one party or the other, and the country's very evenly split now, one part or the other looks at it and says, well, that's partisan. And they're going to come up with a partisan solution. So every one of their recommendations is then going to be criticized. And that goes, but it's more than just bipartisanship between Republicans and Democrats. It's, as Lee has said, it's the character of the people who are appointed to the commission, whether they be Republicans or Democrats. When I heard Lee Hamilton was going to be appointed the vice chairman, I guess Lee and I may have met once or twice. We didn't really know each other at all. So I made a couple of calls. Everybody I talked to said, what a wonderful choice. You'll have no problem working with him. He looks across the aisle. His best interest is the country's interest. He'll always put country first ahead of party, and so on. And so I arrived very happy with my vice chairman, knowing from what I heard from friends I respected that we could work together. But all the members of the commission have got to be people who have been characterized as putting country ahead of party, people who have been characterized as listening to the other side. That's very, very important. And I've said one other thing based on the commissions I've served on, not just this one, other commissions. One bad appointment can ruin the mix. If you have one really disruptive person, doesn't matter which side they come from, one really disruptive person, that can destroy a lot of what you're trying to do. So it's very, as Lee said, it's absolutely vital that these appointments are made with integrity.
So Tom, we both agree with you, having run a couple dozen commissions, that personnel is policy, as I think President Reagan said several decades ago. So in terms of the selection process, do you believe that it's most effective for Congress to pick the chairs and then essentially defer to the chairs to populate the rest of the group? Or, as I think it's often presumed, do you think Congress should identify, the 10 or 12 people who will actually serve on the enterprise?
Well, I'm inclined to think that, look, you have to let the Congress work it out. The product has to be one that is totally acceptable to the Congress. If you're going to get anything done in this country over the long pull, you're not going to get it done by a Republican approach or by a Democratic approach. You're going to have a bipartisan approach. And so you have to give them some broad guidelines, as we've tried to do here, but you've got to let them work out the details of it. And they have to be persuaded that it is their work product that comes out of the recommendations. If they're not persuaded of that, they're not going to give you the kind of follow through you need in order to get anything done. It's very tough getting things done in our government because of just the largeness and the complexity of it. So you have to have focus, and you have to have perseverance. You have to have a clear mandate, adequate resources, clear targets, so people know what they're doing, and above all, perseverance.
So the success of the commission was also extremely important in terms of the influence of the two of you. And obviously, no one could have imagined the trust and chemistry you were able to create. But Lee, you made a very important decision early on, which is to treat Tom as a co-chair. The legislation, everyone says the co-chairs of the 9/11 Commission. You were the chair, Tom was the vice chair. How much did you think about that choice? And do you think that it's important for the Congress to create that semblance of leadership at the outset?
The credit for almost all of this goes to Tom. Tom came to me early on and he said, Lee, I'm not going to make any decision by myself. I'm going to insist that every decision we make be a joint decision. Now, to a guy who worked in the Congress, that was heresy. That was not the way we did things in the United States Congress. You had a majority and a minority, no matter who's in power. And that's the way you work. Tom put all of that aside. And he said, we're going to work together. And more importantly, he held to it. And we would sit down, I think almost on a daily basis, and make decisions jointly. And if we couldn't make them, we put the issue aside for the time being. Sometimes you can't solve every problem. You have to put things aside. So we'd agree to put it aside and address it later. But always we worked in unison. Now, there are all kinds of advantages that come from that. But the thing you have to keep your eye on is implementation. It doesn't make any difference how many recommendations you make. What's important is, are those recommendations going to be acted upon and implemented? And that's where the process becomes terribly important. You've got to have the right process in general, or you have very little chance of getting the kind of sustained effort on implementation that you need.
So, Tom, Lee reminds me that I demoted you and actually flipped the statutory provisions. I apologize for that. But again, it just shows how much you integrated a shared leadership. I want to just touch on one more aspect of your collaboration, and that was the decision to, in almost every instance, make your public statements together. And I believe even refuse some opportunities to speak separately. Talk a little bit, Tom, about just the role of the co-chairs in projecting that kind of shared value, collaboration going forward.
Well, this was because Lee and I were cooperating and everything, but we had to let the public know that we were cooperating, because they're not used to that in Washington. So they had to know this was a joint effort and we were going to do it together. And we did a number of things to make that happen. I mean, we didn't let any Republicans sit next to Republicans in up on committee meetings. We always had Republicans sitting next to Democrats. We went on various news shows, 2 by 2. Lee and I usually went on together. Even if I was invited as chairman, I would call the hosts, calling Meet the Press, and they didn't like it at first because I said, I'd be glad to come on, but please invite Lee Hamilton too. And Tim Russett said basically to me, you don't understand Washington yet, but guests don't invite guests. And I said, well, maybe we can do something some later date or something, and hung up. And he called me back in 5 minutes and said, we'd be honored to have you and Lee. And from then on, we went on 2 by 2. And all our hearings were that way. And we respected each other and who was going to get to questions and so on. And so it wasn't just the appearance of bipartisanship and unity, it was actuality. That's how we actually did it. And we also went out of our way to make sure each member of the commission was respected in his or her point of view and given whatever they thought they needed to do their job. And so it's got to be that way. I mean, I think you've got to have respect for each other, and you've got to move forward as a united group, and you've got to listen to each other. And what happened to us, we became friends. We really didn't. Lee knew more people than I did. I didn't know. I knew Jim Thompson. That was the only one I really knew when the commission was created. But they all became good friends of mine, and good friends of Lee's. And so the reason for looking at the 9/11 Commission is that it worked. So if you can set up a model after something that has worked, you're ahead of the game.
So we have hit this point hard, not just because it's on brand at the Bipartisan Policy Center, but I think clearly we hear you loud and clear that if this is not truly bipartisan out of the gate, not likely to succeed. And so I think we really wanted to make that point, obviously quite iteratively. I now want to turn to probably the hardest conversation, which is the scope. you have both indicated that the clarity of mission was important, that you went back to that mission, over and over. There are some people who believe that it's going to be extremely hard for Congress to actually come to terms around a precise scope and mission, and it should be a little bit broader in framing and a little more deferential. And there are 4 ideas that have been discussed. One is just the immediate risk to members of Congress, their staff, and the people serving the country in the Capitol. And I think General Honore's recent report, which again suggests a lot of just immediate activity. I mean, there is black fencing and razor wire around the Capitol right now. I think that's very clearly an initial part of the discussion. But the place where a broader commission would come in tends to focus around questions of the safety of members of Congress to do their work when inside Washington and just about everywhere they go. Then there's, I think, the more challenging question about, are we just looking at the violence on January 6th? I think Leader McConnell has made it quite clear that he believes that that is obviously among the critical questions that have to be examined, but was seeking to kind of broaden the discussion to include some of the riots over the summer. And then there's another question about, do we really go deep into the societal, kind of crucial foundational questions around social media and polarization that are motivating, I think, a lot of the concerns that then ultimately led to violence. So having kind of shared that broad set of questions, I want to start, Lee, with something you've focused on a lot, which is the kind of conduct of the Congress, whether the brittleness of the institution in some ways inflamed that violence, and whether this investigation should really be just focused on security, or whether it also, as you suggested in your joint letter, think more broadly about congressional capacity. Why do you think that those two things have to be considered together?
Jason, I had a lot of interruptions in your comments, and so I'm not sure I got all the focus of it. But I do want to say that I think the Congress is an institution today that isn't working very well. It's under stress. There are all kinds of reasons for it. It's not going to be easy to get it back in order. But I think the Congress has to put an enormous effort and energy in trying to make sure that the Congress works as an institution. And I don't think it's working very well as an institution today. This is a hugely important matter for the country. Congress plays a central role, the key role, the essential role in the Republican form of government. And we have to get it right. And so I want to see the Congress examining itself and its role and trying to see how it can strengthen the institution of the Congress. I think that might be one of the good things, I hope it's one of the good things, to come out of all of this discussions we've been having as a result of the incidents of a few weeks ago.
Thank you, Lee. So, Tom, recognizing that you are not a denizen of Capitol Hill, but someone who is very attuned to national politics, do you have additional thoughts? Do you think Congress has the capacity for this kind of self-reflection? And also, what's the importance of a distinct mandate versus giving the commission some latitude to kind of chart its own course?
Well, I think you got to follow the investigative leads wherever they take you. And by the way, my father was in Congress for 20 years. My grandfather was in the Congress. In those days, you moved your family down, so I was brought up in Washington. I remember playing in the halls in those days. There was very little or any security, because probably wasn't needed. But so somebody who's brought up, as I was, around the United States Congress, revering the place, this was like a punch to the stomach when this happened. So I care very, very much about the Congress and what happens to it. And I think they have extraordinary capacity, because it's interesting, when you work with the members, Congress has got some extraordinary people in it, wonderful people. But somehow, and Lee's right, somehow the way the institution's working right now, people don't realize that. And it's very, very hard to realize just how good some of our congressmen are and how hard they work. So if that can be part of, if that can enter into it in some way or other, then I think that would be a very good thing. But Congress has got to make a clear mandate. I mean, Lee and I, when we got in trouble, we'd reread the mandate or reread it to the commission. We're doing exactly what the Congress wants us to do. So the Congress has got to work on making that mandate absolutely clear.
So just to reinforce, I think, a little bit of your optimism about the quality of folks and the challenging incentives, I do just want to remind the audience that there has been an exercise, not obviously responsive to the attack on the Capitol, but in the House, the Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress was created, bipartisan group led by Congressman Kilmer and Graves, to focus on just some of the basic attributes of how you run an institution: the schedule, the ability of people to spend time and get to know each other, the ability to have congressional hearings that are not one on top of the other so that members of Congress have the capacity to actually learn about the issues that are before them. And that group came out with, several dozen consensus recommendations. And so I think, we've tried to encourage folks to appreciate that there is a bit of an on-ramp to this conversation about modernizing the Congress in a way that would make it more resilient and more capable of handling the great divisions that are in the country. And so I wanted to share the fact that we agree with you. There is a lot of aptitude and empathy that the leadership could call upon. I want to ask Lee, and I hope my connection is adequate, to talk a little bit about the questions around social media, and actually ask both of you. There are some who believe that the role of social media is unique and needs to be considered in this type of investigation. As Tom said, you kind of follow the investigation where it goes. Does that seem in bounds of potential scope?
I suspect very few people in this conversation and broader that know as little about the social media as I do. That whole business of the social media has come along since I left these jobs in policymaking. But in general, I have come to believe that the social media is enormously important in our system today, and that so many people now get their information through what is we now call the social media rather than the more traditional sources. So people who are much more tuned than I am to PR, public relations today, have to play a role in this and see that part of our communication system is adequately brought into the process.
Tom, are you tweeting these days? Do you have a...
I tweet, but very seldom. Every now and then I tweet, but not
Let
very
me
much.
ask you something maybe a little more in the wheelhouse, because this is another very specific point of contention, and that is the powers that a commission would have and who gets to decide how they're used. So I'd like, Tom, if you can talk a little bit about the importance of subpoena power and how it was exercised in the 9/11 Commission, as that is a key conflict.
Is that me?
Yeah, please, Tom.
You have to have subpoena power. Hopefully, you don't have to use it, but you have to have it, because a lot of the people who want to talk to you are not anxious to talk to you, but if the threat of a subpoena is out there, they'll come forward. I think, Lee, you and I used it maybe once in the whole process, but the fact that it was there was very, very important. And my memory is, and Lee, you can correct me, I could be wrong, my memory is that we actually, if there was any controversy about subpoena, we actually asked the commission to vote as to whether or not we would go ahead and issue. We'd make, I think you and I maybe made a recommendation, but we generally had the commission vote as to whether to use that power, I think. That was my memory anyway.
Well, you're quite right about the threat being the important thing. The one time we did, in fact, use the subpoena power, the people that were being subpoenaed requested it. They wanted it on the record. And so we complied with their request. So, but the subpoena power is absolutely essential. There's some people that don't want you to know what they're doing. And the only way you can do it is to bring them into court or have the threat of bringing them into court, and that brings them around pretty quickly.
My memory was there was a rather kind of artful clause which asserted that the subpoena power could be exercised by the two of you together or by any 6 members of the commission. And while that obviously did not demand unanimity, it certainly created that expectation. And so I remember you saying to me in the past that, while you would not want a commission to be obligated to do everything by consensus, you certainly want the instinct and the desire to move in that direction. So I think that's a provision I know Congress is considering. I want to now talk about just a couple of the other functional issues. One is timing. The 9/11 Commission didn't get started until over a year after the actual tragedy. And then it took 18 or 20 months, I'm sure you remember more precisely than I do, to come up with the ultimate report. Tom, what's your thought about the space between the tragedy and the investigation, and in particular, how that could relate to other legal investigations that are underway?
Well, I think that gave us actually a little advantage because some investigations have already been done, some facts that have already been established. There have already been a committee of the House, for instance, had done an investigation. We were able to use their work at the start of our work to inform us. So that was helpful. But you cannot constrain the commission. You can't set a time that's unrealistic. You got to give them time to do their work. In the same way, you got to give them money to do their work. I mean, you've got to. They didn't do that with us. We had to go back to the Congress or back to the president and say we needed more time and more money because they had given us unrealistic time and money that was, everybody agreed, insufficient to do the job. So hopefully they'll start out right if they do this one, giving it enough time and enough money.
And Lee, you mentioned the combination of commission members and staff and consultants. And if you can, just remind us of the kind of ambition and intensity of that effort. I believe there are about 80 staff and numerous consultants. Does that feel like the necessary? I mean, could you do this with 8 people and a couple $1 million? I mean, how big an exercise do you think this needs to be effective?
I think it needs to be quite large. You ought not to prejudge it. I think you have to go along. We started off with a very, very modest budget and a modest staff. But as we got into it, Tom and I spent hours and hours and hours testifying before different subcommittees of the Congress. At the time, I got a little upset, I guess, with the repetition of it all. But the way the Congress works, it turns out it was a good thing because we educated a large number of members of Congress by appearing before a large number of subcommittees, and that helped a great deal. These problems are difficult. You got to remember they're only one of a whole set of problems coming at them, and so the repetition is part of the process, and it's an important part. I don't know, Tom, I think we started with a budget of just a few $1 million, didn't we? And then
yeah, we started.
Well,
it was a totally unrealistic budget we started with, and everybody knew it. And part of it was, there was a bunch, even though because of the pressure of the families, they all voted for us. There were a number of us who didn't really want us. They just assumed, because they were worried we're going into an election year, and they were worried that we'd make some recommendations that were going to be partisan or affect the election in some way or another. And so they were very nervous about us. So they put us on a very tight leash with little money and little time. And as we got into it, it became obvious to us and to everybody else we couldn't do the work with the budget and the money we had. In addition, one thing my point also Lee and I did, we worked very, very carefully to find the right staff. We turned down numerous recommendations. I turned down recommendations from the White House to start the work. And Lee and I would talk about these top positions and make sure that every single one of them was top quality people. And the other thing we decided pretty much, I think, was that if people have been active in a political campaign recently in either party, that they weren't qualified to serve on the staff. It didn't matter what party they belonged to, but we didn't want anybody who'd been active very recently politically. And therefore, we turned down some very good people on that grounds.
Tom, you just mentioned
I
something.
think it's very important that we made clear at the beginning that we weren't out to get you.
Yes, that's right.
We were going to follow the facts.
That's right.
A lot of people did not like the fact this group was being formed. And they didn't like it because they thought it was being formed to get them.
That's
and
correct.
Criticize them. Tom and I spent an awful lot of time trying to establish our credibility as a commission. We'd investigate the facts and we would go where the facts led us. Once we got that message across and people believed it and we established credibility in that, our investigation was able to proceed and I think make progress that it otherwise would not have made.
So, I think one thing I should note that Speaker Pelosi suggested, which I think has been very well received, is to make it clear that the goal is not a referendum on the former president. And I think
That's right.
that expectation is important. Tom, you mentioned something I think very important, and that is the role of the families of the victims in 9/11, who were an absolutely organized, compelling, strategic voice that I think at many moments in the process helped you sustain focus, accountability, clarity of mission. There is not a similar organized group, I think, as it relates to this current crisis. Am I right that that was a really essential part of the issue? And does that cause you concern about the ability of a 1/6 commission to be successful?
Well, they were extraordinarily helpful because it was a hugely broad group. They took all the members of the families of the people who were killed. It was, thousands and thousands and thousands of people and many, many family groups. But I think we referred to them from time to time as the wind in our sails. Because when we had a problem before the Congress or some other way, where we couldn't get the tools to do the job, they would suddenly show up. And they'd testify. And actually, I don't think it would have been created without the families. I mean, they picketed the White House. They sat down in congressmen's offices, to make sure we get created. Women in particular, there were men too, but women in particular, who had never even been to Washington before, all of a sudden started coming down every day and every week to make sure that we were given the mandate and able to do our job. So they were very, very helpful. There's not going to be any similar group on this one. That's just a given.
A marvelous example of how the ordinary citizen can impact their government. These people didn't know Republican from Democrat. They did not know a congressional committee from a White House committee. They learned in the process, and they learned more than about the process, they learned how to impact the process. Tom and I could not have a meeting that they didn't attend. They were open meetings, transparent, but they attended. And believe you me, they kept their eye on us. They often criticized us to our benefit, I believe.
Yeah.
Well, I became convinced that this was a classic example of how citizens can impact their government. They have to learn the process. They have to embed themselves deeply in it. They have to learn the personalities. They have to learn the issues, and then they can speak with credibility. They just can't take a shot in the dark and appear on television and think they got the problem solved. It's not done that easily.
So I think I have time for just a couple more questions. And Tom, you mentioned the White House and the role of the White House in the design and kind of articulation of some of the rules of the road. This situation is obviously a little bit more congressionally focused than an international act of terrorism. But how do you see the role of the Biden administration in making this effort successful? Should they just stay out of it, or should they be advocating in some way?
They should be helpful because we need them very much. Once the commission is set up, we need access. The commission needs access to files, to agencies, whatever they need. And sometimes those agencies will slow walk you. You'll ask for something and it doesn't come and doesn't come. And you only got a limited life. So things don't come in time. It can be very detrimental to the investigation. The White House was very helpful to us on a number of those occasions. If we made a call over to the White House, all of a sudden the agency responded and we got whatever we asked for. That was very helpful then. I think would be very helpful now. So my hope is that the White House would be active. And by the way, the president, in the setting up of our commission, the president appointed the chair, and then the congressional leadership on the Democratic side appointed the vice chair. I don't know if they want to follow that procedure, but that's one way of organizing.
So let me ask a final question to you both, and asking people to make predictions in the currency of this moment is unfair, but I will anyways. Let me actually start, Lee, with you. Based on what you've been seeing and suggesting, people you've been talking to, do you believe that Congress will in fact create a 1/6 commission that will be able to move through the legislative process and bring some clarity to the nation's concerns?
Yes, I do. I have confidence in the process, and I have confidence in the people running the process that they will, over time, make the right decisions and do the right things. It's a fundamental belief of mine about the process. I know I've been disappointed in the past, everybody is from time to time, but I think the system will work.
Thank you, Lee. Tom, are you also encouraged that they will figure out how to put this together?
I'm encouraged. I'm optimistic, but they've got to be careful because the guidelines that Lee and I talked about this morning are very, very important. And if you're not going to do it in a bipartisan manner, if you're going to put people on the commission who aren't going to put the country first ahead of their own party, then don't do it. You've got to do it right. And I too, like Lee, have confidence in the leadership. I think they can do it right. I suspect they will do it right, and the country's going to be better off when they do.
So a few people I want to express our appreciation for, in addition, of course, to the BPC staff who are scrambling to put these events together with 72 hours notice with exceptional acclaim. But the Bipartisan Policy Center is a team sport. And we reached out to a number of colleagues. Many, many people were interested in this conversation and got a lot of input. And I just want to acknowledge Molly Reynolds at the Brookings Institution, Lorelei Kelly from the Beck Center for Social Impact and Innovation at Georgetown, Erica Newland from Protect Democracy, Matt Glassman of the Government Affairs Institute at Georgetown, Norm Ornstein, American Enterprise Institute, Betsy Hawkins, Managing Partner at Article One, Don Wolfensberger with the Woodrow Wilson Center, and then two people I know are dear to your hearts, Mike Hurley and Chris Kojum, former commission staff, who I think they're staff for life with you guys now, as far as I can tell. Everyone I just mentioned was extremely helpful and thoughtful in kind of designing the conversation we just had. So I thank them for their input. And then, of course, most of all, Tom and Lee, it really is it's wonderful to see you both. And I know that you are going to continue to get a number of calls and questions as this process moves forward, because as you said, Tom, there are not a lot of iconic examples of success in Washington, D.C., and the effort you led unquestionably is one of them. So we thank you for your service and thank you for your advice and encourage everyone to have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.